We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings, this is Burn Power, the Anadromist, and welcome to our June question and answer session for 2020. Not much to talk about now. Yeah, we've got plenty to talk about. Well, I'm not going to ramble. I am going to go straight to the questions, see what you've got to say. Obviously, things are different now. It's gotten to the point where you can read about the most catastrophic locust plague that we've seen in years and years and years, and it's not even a news story. There's a guy named Jacob who writes, "Hi Byrne, it would be interesting to see you detail your metaphysical understanding of the supposed Dark Age we're heading into." I did do a video, The New Dark Age, Prelude to the New Dark Age, so you can check that out if you want to know what he's talking about. Do you view it as something linear, something more akin to a Christian understanding of Revelation, where we will reach a predetermined endpoint followed by an upheaval and establishment of a new heavenly state? Or do you view it as a cycle similar to the Hindu idea of the cycle of yugas, where at the end of the most morally apparent stage, there is a cataclysmic event before the cycle restarts? Do you even believe this dark age is a result of higher forces or purely brought on ourselves through our own foolishness? If so, are we able to avoid it through a concerted effort to remedy our mistakes? I know these are big questions, nobody really has answers, but I'm interested in your understanding of this concept on a metaphysical level, if I haven't missed it in a video you've already made. Thanks for making your content and insight accessible, or at least accessible as I've made it. I will probably deal more with Dark Age concepts when I do another Prelude to the New Dark Age, which isn't going to be like a regularly scheduled series, but will come just whenever it's like, okay, I've got to do another one of these. So, two kinds of things. Well, it's really one thing. What kind of Dark Age is it? First of all, put my cards on the table. I don't believe in cycles. That is to say, I don't believe we're repeating things over and over. Neither in the Greek sense nor in the Hindu sense. Certainly not in the Hindu sense where you have, multi-thousands of years going by before the end of the, 20, 30, 40,000 years before you come to the end of the next cycle. I believe we're in time, which means we're going straight in, following the arrow of time in one direction. So in that sense, yeah, I'm definitely more on board with the Christian idea of there having been a beginning and having been an end. For instance, there was a time when there was no technology as we now understand it, no computers, no telephones, no phones. I mean, eventually at some point, if you go far enough back in time, there was no wheels, and, fire was a big deal. So yes, we definitely are going somewhere. The question is where. And, I don't want to get too deeply into this right now, but I will say this. Yeah, I do believe in a conclusion. I do believe in the second coming of Christ. But I don't think this Dark Age has much to do with it, in the sense that I believe it's like there are not so much cycles that go around and around as much as there are ebbs and flows. So that rather than history going straight like this, it's going like this, up and down. So there are different eras, different epochs. There are the ends of civilizations. I definitely feel like we're in the end of a civilization right now. What was that civilization? We could call it the modern era, I think, and this will become more relevant to another question later on. But we're definitely going this way. Is there anything spiritual behind it? Well, my feeling is, and this is as a Christian, I do believe in a spiritual realm. I do believe in powers and principalities above us. We can call those angels and demons. But the problem is, as soon as you say angels and demons, people get these like fuzzy, weird pictures in their head. And I don't want to give you that. So my idea of what the demonic powers are doing is they're pushing us in one direction. And that direction is always towards a kind of goal, a kind of destruction. But what's the goal? I think the goal is what it was since it was recorded in the book of Genesis, to become like God. I also think that that goal is absolutely impossible, but we will get a whole lot closer than we are now, perhaps after the next dark age when there's another civilization period that's different. But the problem is that as we achieve things and become more and more godlike, we also, what's interesting now is our technology is totally divorced from our morality. So as soon as something is created, people just start exploiting it for whatever it can do, which is why, a good chunk of the internet's bandwidth goes to porn. It's just like, well, there it is. What are you going to do? Well, let's do this. There's no one morally saying like, why? And this has always been true with everything. There have been bad books written since books have been written. Bad books printed since books have been printed. Bad radio shows of different natures since radio was made. Lots of bad television, lots of bad movies, and you get some good stuff. And I'm the kind of person who looks for the good stuff. But I also am interested in why the bad stuff is there as well. So my feeling is it's kind of like there is a course in the river which we are being forced down to. It's not a natural course. Things don't have to happen. That is to say, can we remedy our mistakes? Sure. Will we? Not likely. Not at this point. Jacques Ellul said before World War II that he says there was no point in 1938, 1939 of trying to prevent World War II. They could see the cataclysm coming, at least he and his group could. So what they were thinking of is after the war, which is why I'm not talking about the thing which is brewing in the United States and which will affect the whole globe right now, because I already see that as a fact. That's going to get bubble and boil and get a whole lot hotter, and who knows what that's going to be like. But I'm already thinking afterwards, which is why I'm talking about a new dark age, because that's some of what comes afterwards. So, but can we individually do things? Yes. And I'll talk about this a little bit more with the next question. James White asks, Bern, regarding your video on the new dark age, I am curious about your thoughts on the possible need for new monastic entities, practices to preserve human thoughts as groups like the Benedictines did before. And this whole thing, the Benedictine option, it's sometimes called, has been more and more of an issue. Yes, I do believe that there are things that must be saved. I think we have, for one thing, we've committed far too much of our knowledge and our culture and our memories to the cloud, to the internet, as if, and you hear people talk like this, it's like, well, it will always exist. People say really stupid things like, the internet is forever. Oh, really? Try to find websites that you logged on to in like 2005. Try to find photos that you may have seen back in 2005. And I'm just pulling 2005 out of my hat rather randomly. But, there was a lot of stuff on the internet already. Is it there still? Can you find it? Good luck. But the point is this, you're assuming the internet's going to last forever. I wouldn't place all my money on that, you know? So, but I do think there's a need for preservation, a need for people learning to pass things on. There's been a kind of a sense of this since the 60s in a way, and I think a lot of that was brought on by the pressure of the atomic bomb and the Cold War being on people's heads. So, one thing you found, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms of the 60s, but one of the interesting points was people trying to get back to the land, trying to go back to farming. I mean, this is how you get something like the crafts beer movement, or you get people trying to raise their own food, or all of these things. All of that is great. The real problem, though, is that, I mean, I can see it now what's happening, especially I'm really worried about all of the monuments and culture that have been attacked in the last month. And, okay, well, let's just get this out of the way. Obviously, racism is bad. Is there one person in America who looked at the video of George Floyd, that terrible video, and said, oh yeah, that should have happened. Oh yeah, I'm glad that did. No, there isn't. So this whole thing erupted to try to change our minds. Well, like I said, change it from what? We already all agreed that was bad. There weren't a group of, I mean, maybe there was some white supremacists somewhere who were thinking that's good, but I had the feeling they were probably going like, yeah, I don't want that to happen to me either. So no. Yeah, obviously the police need to be reformed and such, but what's happened since then is there's this other thing. See, this is what drives me crazy, is the media, particularly the mainstream media, is essentially saying over and over and over, we just need to change. The protests were all peaceful. And I'm sitting there looking at the raw feeds going like, what are you talking about? It's like the classic headline out of Britain. 26 policemen injured in largely peaceful rally, which is kind of like, if that's not Orwellian, I don't know what it is, But that's what we're seeing, is this kind of Orwellian speak. Meanwhile, it's like, okay, you want to tear down Southern Confederate generals. I understand why, but the idea of history, and the thing is, you start toppling these things, they aren't the first to go, as we have seen. So since then, they've come for, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. There's in Boston, they want to take away an Abraham Lincoln statue. Someone toppled General Grant. Didn't he win the Civil War against the South? And the truth is, the further this goes, eventually you come to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I've heard people, and I've heard this for probably since the 90s, there's been a contingent of people who say, yeah, we need to get rid of the Constitution in order to create a new thing, which is just sounds, the Constitution has a lot of problems right now in relationship to modern life. The Constitution was not created in a world where everyone has a cell phone. So that does raise a lot of questions. However, the minute you start seeing all of this as the product of some slavocracy, of a bunch of this cabal, we'll get to conspiracies in a moment with another question, I think you're in trouble. So, what that means is, we are seeing this idea, because eventually all of rock and roll has to go. Think about it. Think of the sexism. Think of the cultural appropriation, whether it's minstrel music, obviously that's got to be suppressed from the past, but that's pretty much out of the picture, except where people don't even understand that it's still here. But, you go to the Rolling Stones imitating, Chuck Berry. Well, isn't that cultural appropriation? Don't they have to go? Doesn't all rock music on that basis have to go? And eventually, you get to Eminem. He's a white guy doing rap. It's got to go. It's just that simple. And I'm not talking exaggerating. Once they started pushing over statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and then go to Lincoln, and I'm sitting there going like, okay, what they're basically saying is, the American flag is an evil symbol. It's all got to go. And I'm not saying this as someone who's like in any way a radical right-winger. I'm just simply saying I'm in the center and I'm watching myself along with everyone else, center right, center left. You know, I mean, there are plenty of gay folks who back in the 90s would have been considered on the extreme left who have been pushed to the right without having changed their opinions once. So that they're on my side. It's like, we can all talk now. That's great. But you folks over there who are gaining cultural dominance are, you know, it's like, I mean, well, we'll talk about what this is as we go. Obviously, it's the sujet du jour, you know, so, yeah, we do need groups of people who have preserved things. I'm often sent back to the film Fahrenheit 451 and the community at the end wandering around remembering books. As to me, that is, it's not so much the book, it's not Fahrenheit 451, it's not so much the movie, but it's the idea somebody has to remember. And different people should choose to remember different things. The problem here, however, and this is the serious problem that's hard to get around, is we have been so atomized by technology that it's hard to be in one place for very long anymore. And hard to put down roots because the whole notion of roots has been upended by technology. So, you know, it's just considered normal to live 500, 2,000 miles or kilometers away from your family. You know, it's just like, yeah, you wouldn't want to live near them. So people also don't have the commitments as friends to put things together. This has been one of my problems always. It was a problem in New York City where I saw the city was stronger than any group of people I could get together to hang out and such. I saw it even in Alaska, where there is more stability. Nevertheless, you have a certain contingent of people who come and go every summer to work there. Some will stick around and stay, but still, it's a slower cycle, but still, people move. Well, I eventually left there. I mean, someone I just talked to the other day said, well, I guess it was time to leave after being there 22 years. No, it wasn't 22 years that did it. It was the fact that I spent 22 years there and didn't accomplish much of what I was hoping to accomplish. And that is to say, nothing like this it just seemed like just as hard in Alaska to start something like that as it is in New York City. So, you know, however, I still believe things need to be done. And maybe we're in a time now where people are starting to question some of the things that used to, in the very recent past, be considered the absolute truth, you know, that, and as far as communities and such like that. So, next. Okay. TBROTB, I don't know what that means. It's some sort of an acronym. Anachronistic. No, some sort of acronym. And I have no idea what it's, you know, it's maybe it refers to something, but whatever it does. Asks, you sound relatively sanguine about the pandemic. Do you have any thoughts about the conspiratorial perspectives being propagated? We'll come to that in a moment with the next question. Also, if I may be allowed a second question, is the How Did We Get Here series progressing? Do you know yet when the next part might be released? And let's put it to you this way. I'm going to commit myself to doing whatever I do for the next part in July. And then hopefully get the train back on the tracks. Because I really feel I need to finish this up. And it would be nice to finish it up before the end of the year. And now it seems more important than ever. And, yeah, so how did we get here? Daijin says, hello, Mr. Byrne. Good to hear that you're safe and doing well. I have two questions, if I may. First, I've been following a YouTuber named Benjamin Boyce, known mainly for covering the controversy surrounding Evergreen State University. Recently, he's put out videos in regards to Black Lives Matter protest and riot. In it, there seems to be religious rituals, such as chanting out certain ideology and washing of feet of certain protesters. I've also been watching Pastor Paul Vanderklay's video to understand what is going on. I would like to hear your opinion on these strange rituals. That's my first question. Let me get that one, then I'll get the next one. Well, yes, there is something extremely religious going on. Not only religious, kind of cult-like. And it's that everyone, it's kind of like if you have any opinion with any nuance other than what is now the accepted opinion, which is that Black Lives Matter, and the ideology surrounding that, whatever it is. Most people don't know, but they just feel like, how could you be anything other than anti-racist? Well, the problem is, and this is especially among my kind of, the liberal white guilty folk, they are so sensitive to the pressure of not seeming anti-racist. And in fact, last time this came up during the Ferguson situation, people were coming out, yes, but all lives matter. And nobody got banned for that. But now, if you say anything, you get banned. People have been banned off of channels. They've been, They've been fired because a relative said this. They've been, it's like this has somehow become forbidden. Well, that's religious. It's also highly, highly propagandistic, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here. We've been subjected to this thing. But yes, I've seen the videos of people all kind of repeating, chanting, holding their arms up. It is a religious service. Absolutely. And it's a new religion forming, an intersectional religion. It's not a religion of free speech whatsoever. Do not speak freely in this religion. The problem is they seem to own, not all, but a majority. They're connected to a majority of the media, of the information access. So, they have most of the tech. That is to say that the tech monopolies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these kinds of things are all basically share the same philosophy. Likewise, they're obviously behind a great deal of the product put out by Hollywood, which obviously isn't a specific place anymore, but it's a mindset. And as you see the messages, the very definite messages changing in the media, so that after a while, everything's about diversity, everything's about equality, it's like you can't say anything else. And as I mentioned before, the fact that the past, it's like HBO just said, yeah, we're not going to air Gone with the Wind. And then they said, no, now we'll air it with a disclaimer. At the beginning, an instructional disclaimer. What's going to happen is eventually everything from the recent past even, I don't know if you can air Friends anymore without a disclaimer. Literally, Friends has been attacked. I never watched that program anyway, but it's just like comedy sitcom. The problem is people can't do anything anymore without, it's strange how literal everyone's become. So that jokes of a certain nature are now taken like not as jokes, but as literal fact. Also, education is largely within this one bubble. The book industry is largely within this one bubble. There are lots of exceptions still. However, the impression one gets is that there is only one way to look at it. And this is strange. It's been slowly developing on one hand, but where we are now is largely a result of social media and the fact that, I think if you go back to that guy, I think his name was Terry Jones, who wanted to burn some Qurans back in the day. He essentially did something which, he never did it, he was talked out of it, but essentially what he said was that, by what he did rather than what he said was, by saying that he was going to do this, people in the Islamic world started to freak out. That's the world we're in now, where a word here changes something there. So why do we call it COVID-19 instead of the Wuhan virus, which is what it would have been called back in the 90s or even the aughts? I mean, we were still naming things like Ebola, which is from a river in Africa. No one said, oh my God, it's racist, you're blaming Africans. Because no one was, any more than I would be blaming the Chinese, except if I was a conspiracy theorist, just to head you folks off at the pass who might think that. But no, I think that it's just that it's politically sensitive, and China has a huge influence on the WHO. I still hear people calling it the WHO. It's just like, no, we have a rock band called the WHO. This is the WHO. Anyway, don't get me started on this. But the point is this, is that now someone on Twitter writes they were offended by something. And governments change. One person on Twitter writes something. Governments change policies to reflect this. Well, how can there be any sort of, well, there certainly won't be any justice because it'll be endless. It's just a weird way. It's like it's all become about perception of what's actually going on. We're living in this fictional panorama of events. But, which brings us to the second part here. Ever since the pandemic with protest riots happening, lots of my family and friends have been sharing what some people would call conspiracy theory materials. I usually ignore those videos, but I recently gave in to the demand and watched one of the videos. The topics were government mind control through the CIA and LSD, I think some use of drugs, yes, the MK Ultra theory, satanic cults in Hollywood, and sex trafficking, slavery, and pedophile rings, blah, 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 association with elite members. Now I don't know how to navigate through or even have a conversation with people about these topics because all of the family and friends that are believing in these conspiracies are believing them as truth. Any advice and thoughts for how to have what seems to be an impossible conversation? Thank you again for your time. Videos, knowledge, blah, blah, blah. Thank you, Adaiji. Okay, on the other side of the fence, the people who feel like the media has taken over us, in other words, they have an absolutely, there's a lot going on over here, pressure. So, naturally, people who live in this other bubble are, and conspiracies aren't simply relegated to the right. There's plenty of them on the left as well. People seem to be operating in conspiracy theories. But the main thing to realize is that conspiracy theories are religions for people who don't have religions, or religions for people whose personal sense of faith is weak. That is to say, because they just show you something. I saw, what was it, a PETA video, which was just like, someone just slaps you in the face. And I said to myself, I'm not watching any more of these, because they're obviously just hardcore propaganda and hardcore conspiracy videos. And they're very effective, but they're also lies. That is to say, they are conspiracies. But there's so many different conspiracies you mentioned here. It looks like someone's hooking them all together. And, the satanic cults in Hollywood, sex trafficking and stuff. Well, here's the point. There's always something weird sexually going on. There's always groups of people who are doing something wrong sexually. They're all there. But is it some large conspiracy? See, the thing is, it's kind of like, okay, none of this makes sense because there's a group behind the whole thing that's controlling everything, which is a way of organizing the world so it makes sense. And the truth is that it doesn't often make sense. That is to say, we're living in a much more random period. Like, for instance, if you look at the moments before the sad George Floyd video, that tragic video. If you look at the moments before that, we were just kind of rocking towards, who knows, maybe a Trump victory, maybe whatever. But then suddenly this thing came and all this chaos came out of it. Well, here's the point. Could anyone have predicted that? If you say, oh yeah, here's what I do think, is I think that there were groups, a couple in particular, including Antifa, who were waiting for an event that they could use to push their agenda. But they didn't have that event. And, this guy who did the terrible killing, the murder, just happened to fall into what people were looking for. So, no, I don't think it's, there are conspiracies here and there, but I don't think there's any grand global conspiracy theory. And unless you are the kind of person like I do who tends to study things like this, I'd stay away from it, because the point is this: once you get your head inside of any conspiracy theory, it's easy to see it as true. Here's how you know it's not true. Stick your head in another one, and then you'll suddenly realize, oh, maybe the Jews aren't controlling everything because it's Catholics. I'm just saying. So, in other words, continue to see people as human beings, continue to talk to people. Yes, there are things that can be done. Brian Irby writes, I hope I said the last name right there, it seems approximate. Things are worrying at the moment. I can't look at Facebook or go to certain social events without lots of anxiety and then go into a freeze mode. It's difficult to read the waves, but I was wondering, what are some practices in your life that help you as a Christian, as an Anadromist? Yes, I am. Are there habits, ways of seeing the truth in these new modern times? How do you find peace and equanimity in the flux? Okay, two things here. One practical, one not practical. More personal and philosophical. First of all, and read the waves reminds me of something here. Jacques Ellul, I can't remember, it might have been in his book called Autopsy of Revolution, or one of those books, but he talks about the idea that the things you see in daily life, the things that we get through the media, the things we're on newspapers, all these things that come to us daily, are like waves on top of the ocean. They're big, blustery things, and they tend to grab our attention, and suddenly everyone's focused on these things. But the current below that is moving in one specific direction. So, for instance, you could be in the middle of the Atlantic, somewhere east of Florida, going towards Bermuda, and you'd be saying to yourself, well, these waves are huge and big, and they're moving towards the Atlantic coast of North America. But the water underneath it is not going towards the Atlantic coast. The water underneath it is going towards, it's the Gulf Stream, and it's going towards Sweden. So you have the waves on the surface, and Ellul calls these, the events that capture our attention. But below that, you have the much bigger current. Everything is actually going that way. The waves you see on the top, that's not the way things are going. And this is where I think the conspiracy people are living. They're living in the waves and they're trying to interpret them all as they happen. Well, meanwhile, the current's going one way. Which way is the current going? Well, it's going towards complete surrounding of technology bias and then the breakdown from that. So it's two things at once. One, that we get so enmeshed. It's like people talk about, yes, we're going to get to the singularity. I think humanity will fall apart far before then. I don't think we're ever going to see like robot-like AI taking over, at least not in this go-round. Because the level of fear and panic and anxiety that is created by us all being connected together is so great and now so global that even though this period of time is far, far, far less insane than World War II or the Cold War, there are people who think this is the worst of all periods. Well, in some sense it is, because we are all connected together. And being all connected together, it's kind of like something, it's like everyone here knows what's happening in America. And I'm in Georgia. I am 12 hours away from Alaska. I'm on the other side of the world from where I used to live. So, but then Ellul says below that, are the deeps, like the Marianas Trench, the things that never move. And that's the philosophical things. That's, there always is beauty. There always is truth. There always is love. These things don't change. I mean, someone can come along and question their existence, but to me, that's more on the surface. Because in fact, we all want to learn to love. We all seek to be accepted. We all wrestle with the things inside of us. As Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil does not happen between parties, might I add, between genders or races. The line between good and evil goes down the middle of every human heart. And that's eternal, at least as long as humanity has been wrestling with these things. And that's what each of us has to face in our own lives. That's the thing at the bottom. Meanwhile, the currents of most of the water are going towards, well, in this case, it looks like a waterfall. So, here's a practical thing. Check your news sources. Learn to identify the scent of propaganda, especially for the things you agree with. There's a difference between daily propaganda. For instance, in America, daily propaganda is more like this. I mean, you can see this so much since the 1950s. It's like, you have to follow your own heart. You have to follow your dreams. You have to be yourself. Don't let anyone define you. You're going to succeed. That's American propaganda, which has been spreading around the world, through Disney movies and rap songs and, you name it. Then there's, partisan propaganda. So there's the propaganda of, the left and the right. And right now, the left is essentially saying, "Ha, we got this one. We're winning." In fact, now everyone's propaganda, whether it's your Christian propaganda or your Islamic propaganda, your atheistic propaganda, your left-wing propaganda, your Republican propaganda, whatever it is, you have to question that always, because you always have to remember certain things. There really isn't an us and a them. We're all us. There really isn't, those people are still human beings, and you need to learn to talk to them. These are the classic things that have been said since the time of the Greeks and the time of Christ, the time of the Old Testament. There is something. However, there's another species of propaganda, war propaganda. And that's what we're experiencing right now. War propaganda brooks no opposition. So, imagine having any doubts about World War II in the 1940s in America. Well, you just wouldn't, even if you did. Imagine having doubts about the right-wing traditional American values during the McCarthy period. Well, you didn't. That was also war propaganda. That was Cold War propaganda. So that's when they were rounding up the left-wingers. Imagine after September 11th, trying to make the case that really this whole Afghanistan and then Iran thing wasn't good. Well, people tried to, but you know what? The war propaganda was too strong. Well, now it's flipped. It's on the left wing again. So, in the left-wing sphere, it's basically saying, you wouldn't be racist, would you? And to which, how many Americans are going to actually say, yeah, I want to be racist. So they get you on this, yeah, you've got your privilege, you're white. But it isn't just them. It's everyone has to say the right words, which obviously I'm not. But then again, I'm across the water. I'm not expecting anyone to come find me here, because that would be impossible. So it doesn't matter to me. And so maybe I'm cheating. But the truth is, if you question anything, suddenly, what happens is if you question it too much, you suddenly get pushed out the door into the other side. And like I said, what's happened over time is, and I think I am going to make a video on this, how this, it used to be that the right was considered, maybe, which is your right? Let's see, you're standing over there. That's going to be your left. So, the right was considered this small group of like neo-Nazis and whatever. And then eventually people start saying, well, yeah, but then there's these born-again Christians and evangelicals and oh, yeah, these capitalist people and such. But what's happened is, and so it used to be, for instance, even if you go back to the time of the Clinton and Bush elections, there was the sense that it just goes back and forth, there's a battle. But now it's gotten like this knife edge. But the problem is, the left has been putting a lot of pressure, but they've been pushing out people who disagree with them, which means what used to be the left in the 1990s, with the exception of people who were already in this mindset, is now considered the far right by left-wing people. It's just mind-blowing how this has happened. And here's what war propaganda does. A month ago, it is June 21st. So, a month ago, was anyone saying to themselves, I mean, how many people were saying to this? I'm not talking left-wing ideologues. I'm just talking normal people. How many people were saying this? Yeah, we need to defund or even abolish the police. Yeah. How many people were saying that? Almost none. Everyone recognized, yeah, we need the police. Suddenly, with war propaganda, it becomes something that's possible. Now, the thing about war propaganda, other than daily propaganda, that's different from daily or partisan propaganda, is that war propaganda cannot be maintained as long. But here's my feeling, and this goes back to Daijin's question, how do I deal with these people? Don't. That is to say, you cannot talk with propagandized people. They will not listen. They are in a bubble. It is religious. Any more than you can walk up to a Jehovah's Witness and say, yeah, the whole Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, you guys are a cult. Yeah, are they going to listen? No. And my feeling right now is, I hear all these people, I follow a lot of different YouTube videos, and it's not all from the same perspective by any means, but suddenly I'm hearing all these people who have kind of just said, suddenly they're attaching the Black Lives Power fist, or they're saying, and I'm sitting there going like, or I won't even talk about my friends who are adding the black square, because I just don't like anyone who does these things to virtue signal. It's just like putting French flags or the rainbow flag or, some anti-abortion sign or whatever on your, to identify yourself. Because what that tells me is you no longer exist. It's just the ideology. And I don't care anymore. I care for you as a human being. I do not care for the stuff that's being just disseminated in such an inhuman manner. So, it's weird. So what's the remedy? Read real books. What do I mean? Do not only focus on contemporary issues all the time. Get your head out of today. Learn to see things from the past. Read older books. C.S. Lewis has a great essay on this subject called On the Reading of Old Books. It's just very important that you do. It's important that you go back in time and learn to read other books from other perspectives. Get your head out of this flippin' propaganda stew we find ourselves into. And the only way you can do that is to get out of this time. And since you can't go into the future, which I am sure in the future people are going to look back at us and say that we were absolutely insane during this time, I'm going to say this. You have to learn to get out. And by older, I mean as old as you can stomach. Where someone asked for some book recommendations, and I'm going to give some down below. And then going back to how do you find peace and equanimity in the flux? Well, I start with a foundational understanding of human nature. Since I'm a Christian, that's rooted in the Bible. Someone else's may be rooted in Greek philosophy or Stoicism, maybe humanism, whatever. I'm not going to try to argue these positions right now. But what I want to say is my foundational understanding of human nature is humanity is the best there is and the worst there is. We, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil runs down all of us. That's foundational, which means, am I at all surprised by what's happening now? Absolutely not. I've been seeing it coming for ages. While everyone else has been doing their positive thinking jive, I have been preparing for what I could see coming. I mean, it helped that I discovered people like Solzhenitsyn and Jacques Ellul, and of course C.S. Lewis, but even people like Walker Percy. I'm glad I discovered those people quite a while ago, because that prepared me for like, oh, okay, these are the kind of things that happen. And to get your head out of the nostalgia for even the recent past. Things are not going to go back to the way they were in December. Just get over it. If you need a moment to go up into the hills, take a walk and cry, go do it, because it's not going back. You have to realize this is where we are now. We're not there anymore. We're not in the 90s anymore. We're not in the 60s anymore. And tomorrow, say 10 years down the road, we're not going to be here anymore. Who knows what it's going to be, but it's not going to be this. All things change. So that's how I keep my peace and equanimity. Of course I pray. I read the Bible. I'm a Christian. But, I know plenty of people who do that with this kind of positive thinking mindset. And the truth is, well, yeah, I'm always looking for things I can do to make a difference to people. But I also understand just how hard that is. Really, really hard. I don't know, like for instance, I put, I don't know how many hundreds of hours by now making YouTube's video. Does any of it actually communicate and matter? Well, someone could tell me so, but don't tell me because I've asked you, because that's not fair. What I've come to realize is like, you do things and you don't know what the effect is. I spent 7 years teaching a group of homeschool students in Alaska, hoping to prepare them for the future. I'm pretty sure it didn't work as well as I was hoping. But you know what? It was 7 years well spent. I learned something out of it, and I hope they did. But I know at least a couple of them didn't, and that's life. So, because I am not as strong as the world is. I am not as strong as the propaganda of the world. God is, but I'm not. So, meanwhile, let's see what else we've got here. Richard Lund. This is a very unique question. Did Stalin's purge of the kulaks have a reach into Georgia? Kulaks, for those of you who don't know, who haven't read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, shame on you. No, I don't mean to cast shame on you, but it would be a good thing to read. If you can't read the whole thing, because it's more than 2,000 pages long, just read the chapter called The Ascent. Read the chapter called The Ascent, which is in the center of it all. You'll get the basic message of the book. But I suggest if your time is short, read the condensed version. If it's not, do read the whole thing. But kulaks were the land-owning farmers and semi-nobility in Ukraine and other parts of Russia. So then Stalin basically got rid of all of those people, including Solzhenitsyn's father, I believe. So what we find is that, and that was a serious purge, and it's like the ones that didn't go to the Gulag, most of them were actually executed. Because it was seen that if you have some sort of money and land, you are evil. But here's the thing, they also had the knowledge of how to farm. And it's no accident that the Ukrainian famine, which took another 4, 5, 6 million people, happened right after that, because you got rid of all the people who knew how to farm. It's like if you went through America right now and got rid of all the rich farmers who had a lot of land, we would all starve. It's just that simple, because they have the techniques. They also have the big combines and harvesters, but they have the techniques. It's just the way it goes. So yeah, something like that happened here. Well, they certainly went for the nobility here. They went for the church. They destroyed lots of churches. They got rid of anyone who had certain kinds of intellectual notions. They got rid of anyone who, Georgia doesn't have the population. Now, Stalin, being really Josip Jugashvili, a Georgian, was a little more, was like, well, that's my home. We don't want to totally crush them. So he gave them certain freedoms. But the truth is, I mean, I asked a friend the other day, so what about the kulaks and such here? And she just immediately said, my great-grandfather was in prison for 10 years. So yeah, I'm sure everyone here can tell those kind of stories. So yes, it did come here. Okay, Ebb and Flow. He says, I've got a couple of music questions again. Ebb and Flow, did you change your name? Did you have another name before? Because you got music questions again. I seem to remember someone else giving me those music questions. I'll have to go back and look and see who you used to be. But Ebb and Flow asked, lately I've been trying to listen to the music from all around the world, especially the music in Europe. I've really enjoyed Georgian music, the Georgian music you've made available through your other channels. But one area in particular I can't find a taste for is classical Indian music and Arabic music. How can we tell if it's our cultural biases getting in the way of understanding a form of music, between knowing if the music just isn't as good as other forms? So in other words, is it my culture that says, I can't get into that music, or is it just not that good? Well, here's an interesting thing. Now, one of the people that I used to talk to back in New York in my first couple of years there was Brian Eno. Now, Brian Eno was one of the founding members of Roxy Music, the progressive kind of glammy band. He was also made quite a few very fascinating albums, always exploring technology, but also exploring other cultures. I met him, in fact, when he came into the music store I worked in, and he was looking at Arabic music, and I knew something about it. And so I said to myself, is that Brian Eno? I tried to compare it to the record album covers, which didn't really help me because, promotional material tends to not look like the person. So, and I said, well, I'll walk up to him, ask him if he needs help. If he answers with an English accent and asks for something really weird, it's Brian Eno. So I went up to him and he said, oh, yes, do you have anything by Omar El-Shari? To which I didn't, but I soon got it in. And Arabic organ player, did very fascinating things. So he said, one thing I just can't listen to is Chinese classical music. And he's particularly thinking about the operas. And they are really, really hard to listen to. I have several boxed sets of vinyl operas. Oh, really tough to listen to. So, no, it's very difficult for us to connect to things that we don't understand the culture of. Also, classical Indian music is very philosophical. Well, it's just like if you were to listen to, let's say you'd spent all of your time listening to heavy metal. Heavy metal's not the best thing. Well, let's say heavy metal, but not the classical sounding heavy metal or the prog sounding heavy metal, but the heavy metal that's, really dark and aggressive, black metal, we'll say, and let's say you're listening to that, and then someone says, here's Johann Sebastian Bach, or here's a motet from the Middle Ages, and you're sitting there going, oh man, this has doesn't have any energy to it. Well, that's how it is for us listening to Indian classical music. The philosophy behind a motet and black metal are so radically different that I couldn't imagine a person just go straight to there without having some in-between factor to link them. Indian classical music, in India, there's two key things to Hindu philosophy. One, all is one. Second, there are many, many gods. And you find this in Indian classical music. So, all is one. There's always a drone. There's a drone being held at the same time. Then, it's also the many gods, the many microtones. Now, that's tough to listen to with any sort of musical appreciation if you're just coming to it from any kind of Western music. If you just come straight in there, it's going to be tough. I find, though, that folk music around the world tends to sound kind of normal because normal people aren't doing philosophical music. They tend to just do songs, everyone's got work songs around the world, traditionally. They all tend to sound alike because they're working and someone needs to call something and someone they say push or pull or do something like this. Arabic music also comes from a very specific philosophy. In Islamic culture, God is one, period. And what that means is that unlike the more complex notions of Judaism and especially Christianity, the Arabic music shows that. And how do I mean? I mean, they've got essentially these bittersweet melodies, but for instance, you can get 45 people in an orchestra all playing the same note with no drone, even. Why? Because that is how it is seen. It's like it's all one thing. And so harmony isn't a big key to Arabic music. Now, I happen to love Indian music, but even more so Arabic music. I probably have about, I don't know, over 100 Arabic-related albums, Middle Eastern albums. And I appreciate it. I was fortunate. I was introduced to it by the person who used to sell me these things in New York City when I used to buy for record stores. So I came to understand it very well. But I can see how it would be very difficult for you to listen to that. His second question is regarding progressive rock acts of the late 60s and early 70s. King Crimson, yes. Genesis, Frank Zappa, etc. I'm sorry for those of you who, for whom this might be an obscure subject, but bear with me a moment. At some point, I'm going to deal more with musical things very directly. So, but in a short way, let me just say this. He says, do you think this was the peak of creativity for rock music in regards to how the music was composed in terms of the classical-like structure of the songs? So, by classical-like, I'm assuming you're not saying classical song structure, for which the answer would be no. None of these were in classic song structure, that is to say, verse, chorus, verse. So, by classical-like, I'm sure you're talking about how the music at that time kind of had an infatuation, an inbreeding with classical music, and also with jazz and the more complex forms. So is this the peak of that? I would say for that particular melding, yes, because after that, when I would find rock and classical music melded together, it tended to be in a very different way. For instance, once you get to the kind of, the electronic, the dance music versions that include classical music in it, this is something totally different. This has nothing to do with progressive rock whatsoever. So I think that, yeah, that was a peak for that. Now, if you were to ask me if I think that was the peak of rock music, I would say no, but I'm just going to leave that there because I don't want to go off on a whole thing about music, and I'd rather you just go sit and scratch your head for a while and go, well, what the heck was then? Freddie Rudo says, Byrne, are you jaded as me as seeing all this transgressive art, he puts transgressive in quotes, in multi-million-dollar galleries, the most advanced cities in the world, which then causes art which I prefer to be truly transgressive and make many upcoming, which then causes art which I prefer to be truly transgressive. I think, okay, I see what you're saying. Your sentence is a little mixed up. And make many upcoming artists turn to it, which may sadly lead to the more traditional art being more popular, leading to less than ideal postmodern art reappearing in later generations. I'm assuming it's later generations. Again, there's some of the words are kind of missing from here, but that's life. I'm just seeing this as a cycle that will repeat until the second coming, or what do you think? Here's what I think. The modern era is over. Nothing is coming back. And by modern era, I mean the period from the Renaissance, and we can go back to, Giotto and those Masaccio and those people, all the way up to let's end the modern era at conceptual art in the 1970s. And it's over. Then the postmodern era begins after that. So you started having like neo-abstract expressionism, neo-geo, other neo things, which was all ironic takes on the past. But it's all over. I mean, it's going on, and nothing seems deader to me than art right now. And transgressive. Well, there was a certain interesting aspect to certain kinds of transgressions in art. It's a huge, huge subject, which I am qualified to talk about, but I don't wish to take this opportunity to do so. Here's what I think has actually happened. Modern art is over. The normal people no longer connect to anything to do with traditional modern art. I mean, they go to museums and they say, oh, there's the Mona Lisa, and, there's this famous art. But they don't even understand what they're seeing. I mean, especially if you go to see the Mona Lisa, you can't stop and appreciate it. I made a whole video on this, which maybe I'll link over here somewhere. No, instead, what's happened is, I mean, this art has become commercialized so that you can just put it on your wall. It's the same with old classical music as well. So many classical music stations, knowing people can't handle modern abstraction, have just simply stayed somewhere between Mozart and Debussy, just to kind of go at random there, because there's a certain point at which people lose the ability to be able to connect to it. I'm just talking about common people, not artists, not musicians. So, yeah, I think that what's happened, though, is something new has taken its place. You can see it in graffiti. I just did a video on I've done videos on street art and graffiti. These are very primitive forms of art. You can also see it in fan art. Fan art is very, very strange. It has nothing to do with the art of the traditional world, although it's based on symbolism, romanticism, movie poster art, and all of this sort of stuff. But it's also, you have things like anime. Anime doesn't fit into the history of art at all. People are drawing big-eyed, cute creatures. In fact, people are getting people to draw big-eyed, cute creatures of themselves, portraits of themselves that they use as their profile picture. What does all this mean? This is the new aesthetics. This is the terrible new aesthetics. And I have planned to do a real serious takedown on the concept of cute and the concept and this whole new, this idea of art that's come, because what it is it's kind of like people can no longer, you don't find that many people who care anymore about the history of art. What you find is people, their aesthetic experience is like this, I wouldn't even call it, I was going to say it was like a sugary drink. It's more like NutraSweet, aspartame. It's saccharin. It's imitation sweetness. It's not even real sweetness. It's not real emotion. It's not real anything. It's just, but people will put plenty of hearts and likes on these things, and they will encourage each other. They'll get a dopamine rush because, oh, I painted this big me as an anime creature, or here's my, tag on a wall. It's just like, and all of this is just like, I know exactly where it came from. I've been studying the history of this stuff. So at some point, look for me to do a serious discussion on this. It's the flip side. I often look at puppets versus geekdom. And I have an essay on that back at the Anadromous Live. Or no, back at Gravity from Above. Genesis von Kegler. Ooh, there's a pseudonym. Hey, Byrne, I'm interested in hearing your view on the current state of the sexes in relationship to one another. There was and is feminism, and now many men don't see the whole marriage and kids pattern as an option anymore, but rather as a trap. I tend to see it that way myself more and more, as a trap, that is. Too many outside forces involved. What are your thoughts? Here's what I'm going to say about that. It's a great question. I've been talking too long. It's deep. Yeah, there are lots of problems. That's all I'm going to say right now. And but here's what I would like to add. Don't give up on women. Learn to find women who in some way share your view of the world. I know you probably, especially if you're at all one of the MGTOWs, but there's a lot of philosophy of men who, quite frankly, bitter. But I'd like to point out the following fact. They're not bitter. It's not the women alone who have done anything to you. It's also the men. Any man who sits watching porn at home, and the game with the beer, whatever, can't really complain about what's happened to women since then, because something's also happened to men. I'm going to leave that where it is for a moment. Anonymous asks, and no, it's not the computer hacking group, would be interesting if it was, asks, also, what's your idea of being an adult, especially if you're saying that we're in a very juvenile society? Is it because we're not marrying and having kids as much? No, that's not the central thing. I would say it's the other way around. We're not marrying and having kids as much because we're in a juvenile society. It's not that not marrying and having kids has created a juvenile society. Do you get what I'm saying? And as I just discussed with art and these big-eyed creatures, what kind of world have we come to where 40-year-old adults are living the way we do and consider these strange childlike images to be some sort of aesthetic experience for an adult human being? I think that what's happened with our society is that essentially, well, there's a couple things. One, technology and society does more and more for us. As a result, it allows us to be more like children. So we don't have to do as much. Now, I'm 64 years old. When I was young, I was considered to be pretty juvenile by many of the people who were, like, say, 5 to 10 years older than me. However, I got out of that quickly because it was still implied that one should grow up, or as Jordan Peterson says, grow the hell up, you know. So, and what does that mean? It means taking on responsibility. Responsibility for one's life, responsibility for others, responsibility in life. It's not all about ourselves, you know. So I don't live a life that's all about me. Burn Power is not the most important person in the universe. When I'm in someone else's presence, for that moment, they are. And I have practiced this in such a way as I can say it's caused me personal pain to be involved with other people, because I get involved with them and I suddenly realize, okay, now I'm with them and their problems are this. It's not about me now. It's about what can I do for them? How can I help them? This is not the attitude we find in our society today. For instance, I was just watching the old documentary from the late 1980s, Eyes on the Prize, because I'm trying to understand where was the moment that the civil rights movement went from being such an exceptionally extraordinary thing into the over time mutating into the kind of thing we have today. I'm pretty sure if you went and checked Martin Luther King's grave today, it would be very roiled up from him spinning around in it. The kind of rioting we see isn't even the Watts and Harlem riots of the 1960s, Newark riots, Detroit riots, which had a very specific kind of black flavor. Instead, what we're seeing just insane rioting, really. It is insane. And I've watched so much of the raw footage of this, enough to say, what is going on? You know? So it's that we are not, it's essentially a riot by children. For instance, the whole Seattle Chaz thing, or is it CHOP thing? Chaz is Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which there is a concept they're kind of getting from a mutated concept from Hakeem Bey or Peter Lamborn Wilson's TAZ, Temporary Autonomous Zone. Or the CHOP, which is the Capitol Hill occupied protests, because they wanted to change it so it didn't sound like it would be permanent, but they still want it to be. So the point is, this is and this has been pointed out by, I think, some astute, Tim Pool, very interesting journalist, pointed this out. And by the way, I meant to say this about news sources. We have, you have to realize the biases of our institutions. So that right now, if someone says, yeah, I'm watching CNN, reading the New York Times and the Washington Post, I'll go there's no way you can know what's going on right now. Because these organizations have all, in a sense, been eaten away by the very philosophy that I've been discussing. And that is to say, this idea that if someone posts something, on Twitter and says, I can't believe that Eskimo pie is still around, suddenly Eskimo pie has to change. Whereas I lived in Alaska, and the Indians there all called the Eskimos Eskimos, and the Eskimos called them Indians. Why? Because they're different types of people. Now, of course, the new people say, well, they're racialized. They're not really any different than each other. But the truth is, well, we got the new tribes. So, Fox News is very dependable for being on the other side of the fence. But the problem is that means all these organizations have their own propaganda spin. And one of the people I do watch, now there's other people I could recommend, but it would take too long. But one of the people I do watch, one of the things I do watch is try to find the raw feeds as much as possible, because that's a good way to understand what's going on. Tim Pool is someone I find fascinating. Sometimes he's just blustery and kind of, as he says, hyperbolic, but nevertheless, he's very honest. I look for people who are honest. They can be left-wing or right-wing. I'll listen to someone like... Jonathan Pye is this kind of comedian reporter guy in England, very left-wing. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's honest. I feel he's honest. I feel like whatever he's saying is something that's coming from him. This is his interpretation. And sometimes I go like, okay, you dived a little too far into the propaganda there. And sometimes Tim Pool will as well. No one's utterly free of it. Who's biased? We all are. That's just life. But if you find an institution that's biased, that's a lot more problematic. So anyway, but we live in a time now, I know what it's getting to, the whole Chaz Chop thing in Seattle. And Tim Pool said, essentially what's going on is you have kids that are LARPing, live action role playing. They're LARPing the revolution. And that's absolutely spot on comment, because they don't really understand these things. They're not the old radical intellectuals from like the 30s or the turn of the 20th century. They're not those kind of people. They're people who basically are animated simply by emotion and propaganda and anger and rage and bitterness and their own failings and their juvenile natures. That is to say, they're totally juveniles. They're not seeing other people as human. They're seeing them, well, here's the problem. So even if they do take up weapons and such, they become essentially child soldiers. And if you know anything about the child soldiers in Western Africa back in the 90s and aughts, you'll know that they had the least remorse of anyone for the damage they did. So... And likewise, on the right wing, I see other people saying basically, well, if they're knocking over statues of Washington and Jefferson, we better get armed. And that's not much of a response either. I mean, yeah, stay armed, but don't stop dehumanizing people, no matter what. Even if they start firing at you, they're still human beings. SAC 78008. Okay. Obviously, you don't sign your last name as 78008. Writes, did you ever see Sean Penn's Into the Wild? That's one of those films that sticks with me. I've got bad news for you, SAC 78008. I'm from Alaska, which you may know, and when we saw that film came out and the book came out when I was in Alaska, that and Grizzly Man are considered to be two very dark comedies to us, because... it's like the idea that this guy wants to go off into the wilderness to learn to live honestly without doing a speck of research on the subject. And I've seen these people. They come up to Alaska and they're just kind of like, yeah, I'm here. I'm ready to live my vegan hippie life in Alaska. To which everyone looks at you and goes like, well, where are you going to find the vegetables? I mean, they're here. You can grow some, but... and you could live as a vegan here, but you know what? It's all the system, because if you want to live off the grid here, you're going to have to eat some animals. It's just that simple, especially fish, but also, if someone brings you over, someone actually came over once to my house with a deer that they had hunted on one of the islands in Southeast Alaska and gave it to me. And they walked in with the deer and said, where do you want me to put this? They were just handing it to me, and I would say like, oh, that's really great. Later, half the people in my house... I had 4 other people in my house, who shall go nameless. Half of them were just people who ate whatever was on the menu, and the other 2 were like paying lip service. I really was lip service to being some sort of vegetarian or vegan or something. And so they didn't want to eat the poor deer. So I just said, fine, we'll just eat it. And the group of us had a haunch of deer, which I roasted after curing the thing for a while. And but as we were eating it, they were coming and going, oh, that's so terrible. Why are you doing that? Later, I found they went to McDonald's and ate on the way when they left Alaska. And I was just like, that kind of person drives me insane. Not that those people did. I mean, they're very good friends to this day. They're good. I consider them good friends. But that attitude drives me nuts. So, yeah, I saw that movie, and let's put it to you this way. There's a scene in the movie where he's out in the Alaskan wilderness, sort of in the, we'll just say general Fairbanks area, give or take, 500 miles. And Alaska's pretty big. And he steps into a cold river with his leather shoes on. You just laugh. It's like nobody would ever do such a thing in Alaska. I mean, if you fall in, that's one thing. But to actually put your feet in the water with your shoes on and get your shoes all cold, because the water is going to chill you down. If you keep your feet on, it's just like, well, what about what's at the bottom of the river? Well, I know what's at the bottom of the river. Rounded rocks. That's what's at the bottom of most Alaskan rivers. So you take your shoes off, you put them around your neck, then you walk through. And then you put them back on the other side so you can get your feet warm so you don't get hypothermia. As soon as I saw that, I was just like, oh. And then I watched the rest of the film, and I saw him eating those berries, and I was just like, it's just like, these people who romanticize that as being anything, I hate to say it, but essentially the film struck me as, like I say, a dark comedy, especially Grizzly Man, where the guy goes, the bears are our friends. I've looked at bears in the face from like 20 feet away, and they're not your friends. They're bears. Janine Corbin says, are you doing anything in preparation to start puppet shows again? I wish I could say I was. Part of the problem here is there is one place where I will be able to do puppet shows here, but they're not going to be able to do anything till at least October, November, and they're getting their own stuff ready. I've been doing a lot of other things and a lot of other research. Related to that, James White says, I'm a puppet guy myself, and I'm very interested in puppetry in post-communist countries and the resurgence of productions with religious content like Vertip nativities. Vertip would be nativity plays and puppet shows in Ukraine. You alluded to puppetry sneaking past censors in communist country. Do you have any good resources or more stories or history to share about that? I personally have tons of history to share about that. James, if you want, find a way to get in touch with me, and we can talk on some sort of video chat service about this. But let me just say this now: Bill Baird's The Art of the Puppet has some very interesting stories in it. The book is from 1965, and he has stories particularly fascinating of the stories of the Czechs in World War II, where over 100 Czech puppeteers died. And puppets were actually arrested by the Gestapo. And some of his information on that came from Jan Malik's book on Czech puppetry. Also, I've written about these things. I don't know if you've probably found my website for essays on gravity from above, but if you haven't, go find it. I have written about some of these things in quite a few different essays. But we should talk. I went looking to see if there was any book like Puppetry Behind the Iron Curtain or something. There really isn't. There was so there isn't much written on the subject, which is one reason I got fascinated in it myself. I tend to get fascinated in things that other people aren't fascinated in. Okay, but get in touch with me, James. Knight Arnold, the Knight of the Arnold, asked this question: which books or thinkers would you recommend to a boyo in his early 20s? Well, first of all, I want to say, if you haven't found them yet, I have made 2 videos of book recommendations. This is for books of ideas. And And there's lots more to add to that. But I say a lot about books that you might read for ideas in that. Next, I would say the following that... I was looking for... Oh, there it is. You should get a diet, and this goes with what I was saying earlier about reading older books. You should have a diet of classic literature from the past. And I'm not going to try to be in any way exhaustive. I'll just throw out some names. Of course, you should read the Bible. You should Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, St. Augustine, some version of the Arabian Nights, Beowulf, Everyman the Play, Dante's Divine Comedy. All of those are interesting. Going a little into the Renaissance and Baroque era, Christopher Marlowe's play, The Tragedy of Dr. Faustus, I find quite good. Of course, Shakespeare. There's tons of Shakespeare. The obvious stuff is like Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth. But Shakespeare, King Lear, whatever, it's all interesting. Cervantes, Don Quixote. It's a little tough to get through, but there's something. Here's one I really highly recommend for thinking. Blaise Pascal's Pensees, his Pensees, Pensees, his thoughts. And out of all the stuff from that era, that strikes me as being the most relevant to now. And they're short because it's just, in a sense, aphorisms, little sayings here and there. But when he starts talking about what we would do to divert ourselves, we are totally living in the world he's talking about there. And there's a whole section on diversion. So I highly recommend Blaise Pascal's Pensees. John Milton, Paradise Lost. John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress. Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, actually quite a fascinating book. If you find a non-edited version of it, some of the edited versions don't have all the great stuff about what he was thinking. Daniel Defoe is kind of an interesting guy. Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. James Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I highly recommend the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which you could probably go find someone reading on YouTube right now. I just put that on and listened to it. Or Xanadu. In the 19th century, there's like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Charlotte Bronte, Wuthering Heights. Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, Edgar Allan Poe. I love Edgar Allan Poe. Black Cat, Cask of Amontillado, Follow the House of Usher. Dark stuff, but great. Charles Dickens, you could try Great Expectations, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, Emily Dickinson. Some of her poems are quite fascinating. Herman Melville's Moby Dick. You should read Moby Dick. Mark Twain. You should read Tom Sawyer and especially The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And Henrik Ibsen's play, The Enemy of the People. Find a good translation. That's quite fascinating. I really highly recommend the work of George MacDonald, Scottish Christian novelist, particularly his fantasy books. Lilith is an amazing dark novel, but also his children's work, particularly The Princess and Curdie and The Princess and the Goblin, but also his short stories like The Wise Woman. The Light Princess is great, but my all-time favorite, super short, about 25 pages long, The Golden Key. Cosmically beautiful and meaningful. That's all I'm going to say about that. Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, War and Peace and Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. If you haven't read, get Dostoevsky on your list. The Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment are both great. Find a good translation of those. And anyway, I could go on into the 20th century, but you get the idea. You should have a diet and get involved. Obviously, you can't read all of these all at once, or even in a year, but you should start somewhere. Think of some authors from the past, and really, like I said before, you have to get out of this loop we're in now and discover the past, because the past has answers to the questions. The past is a place with rights of its own. We have not transcended the past. The past has, of course, people made mistakes. So, St. Augustine has, certain kinds of prejudices. Well, those are the prejudices of his late Roman period. But where he is unique, he is utterly unique. You see, everyone in the past had their prejudices of their times. But once you find out, Dostoevsky's got quite a few different issues one could bring up. But once you get into his work, it doesn't matter because it's Dostoevsky. And that's what I highly recommend. So but get in touch with me if you want to think more about the 20th century or something. I could go on, but we'll just say that's a place to start. Just thinking about classic canon of Western literature, and don't listen to what people are saying now about, how you have to go everywhere and find everything. No, you need to hone down and do one thing, and I think this is what you're looking for. Finally, our anonymous questioner again asks, what is your concept of meaning and purpose for atheists? Faith is a gift, and not everyone has theirs. So what's your version of a good or moral life when there's no objective right or wrong? Okay, well, first of all, let me just say I don't think faith is necessarily a gift. In other words, there are some people who don't have faith and some people who do. Interestingly enough, in the New Testament, Paul says faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So the main point is you've got to be listening. So what is faith, though? A lot of people have this kind of, I guess it's almost a Kierkegaardian definition, although Kierkegaard was much subtler than this, of a leap of faith. It's like, I don't know what to believe, but I go there, which I don't have. My definition of faith is more like this. Faith, we use other words like trust. Trust is a good word to put here. Like, for instance, when I first meet somebody, I don't trust them, but I don't distrust them. They start pretty much at zero. Of course, there are visual cues to what kind of person they are. There is, if I meet someone who's carrying a knife, well, that's a visual cue, but that doesn't tell me anything yet. Why do they have the knife? So we take visual cues, but then you start talking to someone, and after a while you start learning like, oh, I can talk to this person and they're really good for philosophy, but don't ask to borrow any money from them. Or someone else, they'd love to lend you money, but don't talk philosophy with them, you see. So, but you learn to trust people. Well, in life, I've learned to build upon the things I trust. So, I trust, for instance, what I said about human nature, that it is both good and bad. When I meet people who have a very naive view of human nature, I say those people are going to have great problems in life. It's always true. And so I can build on that. I can build on the fact that human nature is really, really much more complicated. If someone says, oh, I just like musicals, I don't like thinking about things, I go like, yeah, there's more there than you're letting on. If someone says, like I knew this one girl who just liked like Snoopy from the Charlie Brown and Peanuts comics. Just Snoopy. So she had Snoopy images and stuff. And she was actually Dutch, and she came to America, and she visited me. Completely naive about life. Completely. When I heard about her years later from some mutual friends, I said, oh, have you heard about her? And they said, oh, she looks totally different now. She looks totally bitter. Well, why is she bitter? It's because she went through life expecting this kind of big, odd, cute thing about life. And guess what? Life isn't at all like that. That's just an image someone's created. So once you see that, so I build on that. Is conversation real? Yes, I believe so. I believe I can really communicate with people, and it's not just lab rats pushing on pedals. But it is indeed real human communication. Sometimes people do want something that they're not talking about, and there are all sorts of motivations. But the one thing I'm sure of is that it is valuable to communicate. I'm also sure that our communication is very different than anything in the animal kingdom, certainly anything in the plant kingdom. And as a result, that points me back towards communication and words and language and meaning being foundational. And it points to the fact that relationships are foundational. Since I came to these conclusions back in the early 1980s, I've never had to say like, well, maybe there's no such thing as communication. Maybe our relationships aren't important. It's obvious they're really important. The problem is they're really hard as well. This is why a lot of people give up on others. And also we're fed a steady diet of live for yourself. So, concept of meaning and purpose for an atheist. Build on what you know and trust. Everyone knows and trusts something. If all you knew and trusted was that in the morning you really like to eat eggs are great, build on that. Owen Barfield says you start anywhere, eventually you'll get everywhere, and I believe that. So if you start trusting on what the things you know, but don't trust the things that do not reveal themselves to be trustworthy. That's why I said for people, if a person doesn't reveal themselves to, for instance, I wouldn't walk up to someone I didn't know if I was like short of money, which I have been in my life, and say, hey, can I borrow money from you? That would be insane. I would have to form a long relationship with someone before I would ever ask for something like that. Because I don't know what that would do to our relationship. So there is a good or moral life. So for instance, I think you can put anybody, no matter what they believe, can put their money on the fact that relationships are the most important thing. That is to say, to have good relationships with people. I don't like the phrase no objective right or wrong, because I believe there is a right and a wrong. The problem is us, not right and wrong. The problem is that we ourselves are limited as far as what we can actually grasp in life. We can't grasp everything. We can't know the truth exhaustively about anything. However, we can know more than we used to know, which means we can add to what we know. I am pretty sure I could say there is no subjective way in which I could justify taking the life of a baby or committing some act of molestation. There's no way I could justify that. So we can put that in the category over here of like, yeah, that's pretty objective. But objective is the wrong word. Michael Polanyi in his book Personal Knowledge, which if you're at all philosophically minded, I highly recommend. He basically says it's not that knowledge is objective or subjective. He doesn't like calling it subjective. He says it's personal, which means it goes back to the relationship between the persons. So, Walker Percy asked this question in his book, Lost in the Cosmos. He says, could a nuclear scientist, very well trained, very knowledgeable about physics, find personality in the world, personhood, we'll call it, is a better word than personality. It's a larger concept. Could they find that in the world if they themselves were having questionable relationships with people of the opposite sex, cheating on their wife, for instance, regularly with different people? Could they find it in the world if, knowing that, would call that into serious question? And he says the answer is no, because our knowledge is personal. We tend to look for the things we're trying to look for, which is why it's so important to listen to other opinions and to read books. Like, for instance, I do not personally know what it's like to float down the river, the Mississippi River, on a raft in the middle of the 19th century, except that I have read Huckleberry Finn. That tells me something. And if you want to get outside of your own personal bubble, you have to have good relationships with people. None of us have perfect relationships. Therefore, all of our knowledge has got to be faulty. Even the fact that none of our knowledge can be exhaustive. It's all faulty on some level. But that doesn't mean we can't add to our knowledge and know more. Faith and knowledge, I think, relate like this. This is how I've seen it. For instance, I know certain things that I can rest on. I can rest on the fact that all relationships are important. This is never a problem for me. That knowing humanity, also that all relationships are going to be difficult and problematic at some point. I can rest on that. Therefore, I go ahead and meet new people whom I don't know, not knowing what kinds of issues they have, never knowing if you're going to meet someone whose personal issues are like a whirlpool and will suck you in, such is life. But here's the point. The act of faith comes there. Here's an interesting, I think I'll end with this. There was I might have said this before somewhere, but this seems to be a good place to say it again. I heard a sermon once by a friend of mine. This was at the L'Abri Institute in Switzerland. And he was talking about what is faith. And it was an interesting story he told. It's just obviously a made-up story. But he says, so there was a man who was walking along the edge of Niagara Falls one day. And he saw that there was a man who'd stretched a cable all the way across Niagara Falls. And he was going to walk across that cable. And so the man looks at him and looks at the tightrope walker and says, so you're just going to do this? And the tightrope walker says, do you believe I can do it? He goes, well, I see you're in pretty good physical shape and you've got one of those long poles that you use for balance. And I said, well, I guess so. So the guy says, well, let me show you. He walks across and slowly walks back. And the man, when he gets off, the man says to the tightrope walker, wow, that was just incredible. That was great. And he says, and the tightrope walker says, well, do you think I could take a wheelbarrow out there, a wheelbarrow out on there with, like, say, 200-pound sacks of cement? The guy goes, gosh, well, let me see. And the guy picks it up and he goes out and he goes across the river and he comes back with the wheelbarrow full of 200-pound sacks of cement. And the tightrope walker turns to him and says, do you think I could carry a human being out there? And the guy goes, well, I just saw you with a wheelbarrow go across and back with 200-pound sacks of cement. That's like the average human is less than that. So, yeah, I think you could do that. And the guy goes, well, hop in. Up to the point where he said hop in, there was no acts of faith going on. It was only an accumulation of knowledge. The act of faith comes when you have to act upon it. I'm not going to go into my own personal history, which I may have done in my time series a little bit, but the point is this. At a certain point, you have to hop in. That's what faith is. So faith is not, I don't think faith is a gift. I think faith is an act based upon trust of what you know. That act has unforeseen consequences. Just as, like I say, I believe all human beings have some worth before God. That doesn't mean the next person I meet, it's going to be a nice, cozy relationship. But I am willing to talk with people, whoever they are, and find out who they are. Okay, I've been going on and on and on. I was thinking of dividing this into two, but I think I'll just leave it as one huge question and answer session. And I hope, I don't know, did any of this make any sense to any of you who ask questions? I hope so. There's always much more to say, and every time I say anything, I think of all the things I should also say. But again, I could talk for a lot longer. I'm talkative. So anyway, this is Bern in Tbilisi, Georgia, telling you to be careful during these times. Do not believe everything you read. Test things, as it says in I think it's the first letter of John. Test the spirits. Test what's going on. Do not simply go with the flow. Learn to think for yourself. Learn to find sources that are good. If you want, at some point I may do something on how to find good sources for information and news, but it's too big a subject for now. Anyway, take care, and we will meet again soon.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.